Hey everybody, welcome to the final event of the 2020 Global Order Colloquium at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's Global Public Policy Hub. Our Global Order Colloquium this year is on the UN at 75, Coronavirus and Competition. I'm Michael Horowitz, Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry Worldhouse, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy. Thank you all so much for being here today. And before we begin, a few logistical notes. One, following the conversation, we will open the discussion up to questions that have been received from the audience. Two, to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle. Three, you will also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for technical or logistical issues. We will also drop resources there during the event and at the close as well. Finally, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and the Q&A, which will help us have a successful event. This colloquium is made possible in part by the generous support of Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Elliot and Harriet Goldstein Private Foundation and Jesse Friedlander, and Paritosh Thakur and Hamal Marani. I'd also like to add a special thanks to the Center for the Advanced Study of India for their assistance and once again inviting Ambassador Singh to Penn and for being a wonderful partner to Perry Worldhouse. We're honored to have several distinguished speakers with us today, and to introduce them, I'd like to welcome Dean Stephen J. Fluharty. Steve Fluharty was appointed Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and Thomas S. Gates Jr. Professor in July 2013. A member of the Penn faculty since 1986, he holds primary appointments in the Department of Psychology and in Pharmacology. He also has secondary appointments in Neuroscience and Pharmacology in the medical school. He is one of the few people that I call boss at Penn, and we're honored that he took time today to spend with us. So thank you, Dean Fluharty, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks also to the staff at Perry Worldhouse for putting together this event. And thank you, as always, to Richard Perry, whose generous support has helped us usher in a new era of global engagement here at Penn. As Mike said, today is the final panel of this year's Global Order Colloquium on the UN at 75, Coronavirus and Competition. I hope you had a chance to tune in for some of the other incredible discussions that have been happening virtually here at Perry Worldhouse. There have been exchanges about the future of global health governance and the race for a COVID vaccine, about the UN in an era of great power competition, and about the future of the World Health Organization. With this next panel, Perry Worldhouse is closing this series on an extra high note with a discussion involving some of the world's most venerable and distinguished diplomats and policymakers, featuring Catherine Ashton, Irina Bokova, and Arun Singh, a true global leaders conversation on the future of the United Nations. So let me briefly introduce our esteemed guests. Catherine Ashton, the Baroness of Holland, served as the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Secretary Security Policy from 2009 to 2014. She has brokered historic international agreements and on behalf of the UN Security Council, chaired the negotiations that led to the Iran nuclear agreement. She was the first female EU Commissioner for Trade, and before that, a leading British politician. Lady Ashton now holds several high-level roles in foreign and security policy. Irina Bokova served 2 terms as the Director General of UNESCO from 2019 to 2017. She was the first woman and the first East European to lead the organization. Ambassador Bokova has worked at the United Nations on behalf of Bulgaria, served as a member of the parliament in Bulgaria, and served in government as First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and as Secretary for Foreign Affairs. She was also Ambassador of Bulgaria to France, Monaco, and UNESCO. Arun Singh was India's ambassador to the United States from 2015 to 2016, and Deputy Chief of the Mission to the United States from 2008 to 2013. Ambassador Singh has served in high-level diplomatic positions around the world, including as Ambassador of India to Israel and to France. Like our other panelists, Ambassador Singh has deep expertise on the UN, including through his experience as counselor at the Permanent Mission of India to the UN. It is indeed an honor to introduce these distinguished panelists who will first give short opening remarks and then engage in moderated conversation with Tracy Rubin, an award-winning Trudy Rubin, an award-winning journalist and the worldwide Worldview columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I might add, a Perry World House visiting scholar. And now our panelists will begin their remarks with Catherine Ashton. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Truharty and Mike. It's great to be back in Perry World House. Like everyone else, I'm just sad that we're not sitting in that wonderful area where we've had the privilege of having so many great conversations. But you know, nothing could be more important than thinking about the future of the United Nations. 75 years since it began. We can reflect back on an organization that has been tested and proven to be of enormous importance. The European Union, and certainly when I was High Representative, regarded the UN as a critical partner in so much of what we did. We were a huge supporter, both in terms of the resources we gave to the UN, but also in terms of the respect we felt for the work that the UN was trying to do across the world. Never easy, and never easy when inevitably the difficulties and challenges that they were dealing with were incredibly important to one or several or many of the members of the organization itself, and arguably at times working with those who were on opposing sides of where the conflict should end. I would begin by saying this: the drumbeat really of the UN talking about values and ideals based on its original charter, based on the work that it has done, is a crucial and vital element of what the UN does. It may not feel always that it's the most important action. It may not get the headlines, but the fact that the UN consistently believes in, talks about, tries to push forward our nations and our world in thinking about the collaboration, the ideals, the values is really important. Linked to that, the debates at the United Nations. We have all visited, or people on this panel will certainly have visited, the UN General Assembly and listened to the set pieces, or not listened to the set pieces, depending on who is speaking. We have all recognized that it is a place where people come to make their points, to raise their issues. But it is in its own way a space where that is able to happen, where we are able to disagree and agree, where people put forward points of view, and where that debate is a continuous element of the mechanism, if you like, of the United Nations at work. And I don't think we should undervalue those two important parts of the backdrop that the UN creates to the work of diplomats and the work of organizations in the future. The second point that I'd like to make is about my experiences working, as Dean Fluharty said, on the Iran nuclear agreement. In that capacity, I chaired meetings which were in America, the P5+1, in Europe, the E3+3, 6. In the P5+1, of course, Germany was the nation that was outside of the permanent membership of the Security Council. But the P5 worked collaboratively for years. I worked with them for 5 years, and I neither began nor ended the process. The point I would make is that within that framework, we found ways to continue to collaborate regardless of what was happening outside. It was a way of trying to address a problem with a commonality of view, despite the fact that within the 5 nations, there were extraordinarily different views about what outcome would be satisfactory. Regardless of that, all stood together, all agreed that until all were satisfied in an agreement, it could not stand. And it occurred during a period of time that was extremely turbulent. In 2009 to 2014, many things were happening, but perhaps in this context, most significantly, the crisis in Ukraine, where we continued to work alongside Russian colleagues in dealing with the Iran nuclear deal at the same time as our deep concern was manifesting itself in sanctions and in pressure on Russia to change course. And I raise it because I have believed since that time that this was a framework that we discarded. I understand the reasons in terms of the decision of the United States president, but nonetheless, it was a way of collaborating on an issue that I think should be reflected upon as we consider the future. My third point is about form and function. I think we have to think carefully about what the UN is going to be doing in the future. There have been many discussions about changing the numbers of the Security Council, the way it works, of how the UN operates. And all of these are valid and important discussions and debates. Achieving change is going to be extremely difficult, as those of you who work closely with it will know. But making sure that it continues safely and securely is really important. And one of the things that has to be examined is how we fund the UN and how we fund its agencies. The reliance upon the big donations that can be withdrawn because times suit, or because politics are different, or because of disputes or whatever, does not allow organizations to do their work. And I strongly believe that we need to think really carefully about ensuring the independence and the ongoing work of organizations is not held hostage because of other considerations that are important but should not be reflecting on that work. And it's at this point that I get the pleasure of handing over to my colleague Irina Bokova, whose work at UNESCO is absolutely extraordinary, and it's a delight to be with her.
Thank you so much, Catherine, Lady Ashton, for this very kind presentation. And I take over from your very, I would say, inspiring and enlightened look at the United Nations. I'm also very happy to be back to Perry World House. And as you, I think we share, all participants here in this panel, a bit of sadness because we didn't envisage to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations in this way. An organization which indeed is unique. It's unique because it has the legitimacy, it has the convening power, it has the normative impact like no other organization. And as you did, I would like also to remind the very many achievements of the United Nations all these years in terms of brokering agreements, peace settlements, of settling nation-to-nation conflict, of having a humanitarian action in saving lives of millions of people, of educating children, of vaccinating them, of including, I would say, the important work in ensuring equal rights of women, because this year we also celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Plan of Action. I would, as a former Director General of UNESCO, I would like also to mention another perspective, which is important from the UN point of view. It is the very unifying idea of a vision of humanity that is diverse, but also that shares common values. And I'm speaking, of course, about the World Heritage, very much an American idea. I would like to mention here and say a special word of a man who brought this idea. This is the Honorable Russell Train, because he left an undeniable mark on the environmental protection of the United States. First, nowadays we speak about nature protection of environment and climate change. He was his leadership of the World Wildlife Fund, and then for giving the idea during a conference in 1965 at the White House about the importance, in his words, to identify, establish, develop, and manage the world's superb natural and scenic areas and historic sites for the present and the future benefit of the entire world citizenry. I think it was a very revolutionary idea that was embraced by UNESCO with the adoption of the World Heritage Convention. And I would like to remind now, in a world that is divided with very contentious and changing geopolitics, something that also he said in 2002 when the world was celebrating the 30th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention. He said at that time something which is very much relevant today. He said at this particular time in history, as the fabric of civilized human society seems increasingly under attack by forces that deny the very existence of shared heritage, forces that strike at the very heart of our sense of community. I'm convinced that World Heritage holds out a contrary and positive vision of human society and our human future. And of course, we should not go very far to mention some of the very emblematic sites, US sites. I'm speaking, of course, about the Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution was sited in Philadelphia, whose influence stretches, I would say, beyond the US to the world. Of course, I'm speaking about the Statue of Liberty, which was inscribed on the World Heritage List precisely because it is a defining symbol of the United States of America and, of course, of the world. Now, as I said, this year was really supposed to be a year of ambitions, a year 5 years after the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 adopted 5 years ago, 20 years of the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and as I did mention, the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Conference on Women and Equality. And it was important because this year was really the year where policymakers, all the stakeholders were supposed to take stock against climate change 5 years after Paris and to make a big push for more bolder and robust policies. Particularly, I would say, after the very disappointing COP25 in Madrid and the shocking wildfires we saw last year in Australia, Amazon, and this year in California, just a few months ago. Instead, and this is very frustrating, that there is a feeling of discouragement that gradually undermines all this progress that has been done, and that affect them, I would say, the rules, the very fundamental multilateral rules. And in increasingly crisis that we see today, the respect for international law and recourse to dialogue appears to be an attainable goal, something that you, Catherine, just mentioned with the Iran deal. And the multilateral grammar, which I would call, that is to say, all these values, rules and procedures that shape the post-war international order are slowly regressing and its use lost in all this changing geopolitics, where unfortunately the balance of power supplants diplomacy. And I think this really is a very worrying tendency. So we are kind of in a crisis within a crisis. We are in a state of urgency, and we say today that we want to build back better, but how to do it, I think, is the big question today. And it is very, I would say, befitting that the General Assembly resolution on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations was saying we are not here to celebrate, we are here to take action. I think this is a very important opening lines. So just to move a little bit to what I think we should do, I really believe that there is a need for a very strong, broad movement, not just governments, but I would say the private business, the civil society, academia, a strong movement towards in support of multilateralism, kind of a new support, a new idea of a new global contract or a deal. There are different appeals for that matter, I think is very important. And this new deal should look at three issues: how we really ensure that power, wealth, and opportunities are being shared. A new kind of a commitment also to the basic values of the United Nations Charter. Because I do believe that, and if you look at this crisis, whenever we go around, that withdrawal into oneself and the fundamentals of international society is simply a dead end. And if there is an absence of internationally accepted rules, everyone can see that alternatives are leaving the problems actually unsolved. So I think the health crisis, the COVID crisis, has in some way wakened up to review once again the already ailing multilateral order. But at the same time, it highlighted that the way out of the current crisis is multilateralism. And in its own way, this pandemic reinforces, I would say, the starting postulate that about the essential character of international cooperation, which states, I would say in a very simple and clear terms, that unilateralism cannot be the answer of the challenges of our time. So now it gives me a great pleasure to pass on this conversation and the work to a very distinguished Ambassador Singh. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Bokova. And as you mentioned, the multilateral process, the United Nations seems to be going through a moment of crisis. And so as we mark 75 years of the United Nations, I wanted to share some thoughts from my perspective. The United Nations is an organization of member states. So if it is working well at any point of time, it is because member states are able to come together and cooperate with each other. If it is not working well, it's a reflection of the fact that member states are not able to work out compromises or work out coordinated positions. At one level, the UN has had problems from its inception, because when it was established in 1945, it was initially meant to reflect those who had declared war by 1st March 1945 on the Axis powers. And then later it was expanded as an organization that would welcome all the free nations of the world. But there was a time when the USSR had walked out from participation at the UN Security Council. For a long time, the government in Beijing, China, was not a member of the United Nations and became a member several decades later. In terms of perception from outside, the UN seemed to be working more efficiently when we went through the unipolar phase after 1990, because it was at that time that basically the US, the European, the coordinated Western approach to issues that prevailed through the multilateral system and was accepted by the others. And that was the time when new norms were sought to be established, for example, through the Rio Conference in 1992 on sustainable development, climate change issues, through the Beijing conference that you mentioned on women, the conference on population, the World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen. So new norms of governance, new norms of international cooperation were sought to be established with some success at that time. But subsequently, this unilateral phase ended. Russia began to assert and seek its own interests in the international context. China moved out of its phase of what was described as hide and bite. Hide your strength, bide your time, and started asserting Chinese interests. So today we are finding, as you referred to, more and more unilateral actions by all the major players in the world. The United States has taken unilateral action earlier in Iraq. It took unilateral action against Serbia in the context of Kosovo in 1999. US has unilaterally walked out of the Iran nuclear agreement that Catherine Ashton was also involved in for some time. And Russia, in turn, has taken unilateral actions in Georgia, in the context of Ukraine, Crimea. And now China has at one stage said to countries in ASEAN that we are the big country, you're the smaller countries, and that is a fact, and you have to live with it. And they have taken unilateral actions in East China Sea, South China Sea, militarized islands in South China Sea. So I think that is the essential challenge that the multilateral processes and the world is facing, that the major players in the international system are not able to have a convergence on views on how to manage their relationships, and they're all taking unilateral steps. And as a result of that, and as a result of what we are seeing with the impact of COVID, the international order is currently in a state of major flux. The United States is struggling between its policy of America first, or should it emphasize the importance of allies and partners? There seems to be, the President Trump articulates it in one way, members of his administration in discourses articulate it in another way, And much will also depend on the outcome of the elections next month on who emerges as the winner of the elections. China is trying to bring about a new order through its Belt and Road Initiative. It has worked out a 1+17 arrangement in Europe, essentially splitting the European Union. It is holding China and Africa summits, again, as a way of establishing new relationships in the international context. And Europe is going through its own floods. The process of integration within Europe seems to have come to a halt. It is facing the challenge of Brexit. Europe talks of democracy as a binding force, but many countries within Europe are now being named by the European Commission for having walked back from democratic norms and practices. And Europe has now moved to label China as a systemic rival. And the United States, which had led the world in establishing several of the international organizations, has now opted out of membership of many of them, including the Human Rights Council, UNESCO, WHO, and has effectively brought the process at the WTO to a halt by not nominating members to the appellate body. So given this background, among the conclusions one can reach is that clearly we need the United Nations. With today's connectivity, with the global nature of many issues, including climate change, pandemics, political impact of actions that countries take, there has to be a framework where countries come together and interact with each other. But one cannot perhaps expect too much decisive action at the UN. And while discussions, exchange of views continue at the UN, what we will see more and more are networks of relationships being created to influence the emerging international order. And I refer to some of the steps that China has taken. We can see, for example, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia emphasizing more and more the Quad framework. And the foreign ministers of the 4 countries met just yesterday for only their second meeting and the first outside the framework of a UN meeting, when they came together for a face-to-face meeting in Tokyo as a very deliberate signal that they're holding a face-to-face meeting. In some contexts, middle powers are asserting themselves. We see in terms of the unilateral actions that Turkey is taking. We see that soft power generally is in decline. The soft power of the United States is in decline with its unilateralism, with the fissures in US society. The soft power of China is in decline with its wolf warrior diplomacy and some of the assertive practices it has adopted in Europe. The big power influence also seems to have limits. US could not achieve its objectives in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Venezuela, and Syria continues to go through a stage of flux. And a complicating factor has been the impact of social media, tremendous amount of disinformation. So recalling all this, I remember the words of the US President Roosevelt on 1st March 1945, when he addressed the US Congress soon after the Yalta Summit. And he said the purpose of the UN was to end the system of unilateral action, exclusive alliances, spheres of influence, balances of power, and all the other expedients that have been tried for centuries and have failed. But unfortunately, this is exactly what we are seeing today. So it's a challenging moment, but there is a lot of work for the international community to do. So on that note, let me hand it over to Trudy to conduct a conversation.
Thank you. Oops, am I unmuted? Yes. Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh, and also been asked not to say Lady Ashton, Catherine, Ambassador Bokova. I think you have really set the scene for how difficult it is to answer the question of whether the United Nations at this point in time. And I'd like to pick up from several points that Ambassador Singh just made. First, before I forget, I want to remind everyone that you can start asking questions now at the Q&A function. I see several people have already done so. But coming back to these points that Ambassador Singh made, At the UNGA, the virtual UNGA, the Secretary General said the UN is at a 1945 moment. And what he meant, I think, syncs with what the ambassador said. There are huge structural changes going on. And so the first thing that I would like to ask is, how much do individual countries like the United States matter at this point? Are the structural changes worldwide that Ambassador Singh talked about, the shift to a nationalistic outlook, the decrease in democratic norms, are they so deeply rooted in political and sociological developments in recent decades that individual countries are no longer the critical drivers? Or, and I'll start with this question, if former Vice President Biden should win the election, and there were somebody leading the United States who, at least we believe, supports multilateral organizations, could that make a difference? Or are the global changes so great that at this point, even an actively multilateralist US president couldn't make great strides to setting things right? Maybe let me start with Ambassador Singh and then move on, because I'd like to hear from all of you.
So Trudy, responding to your very specific point, I think a Biden presidency clearly would articulate an approach to the UN and multilateral processes somewhat different from what a Trump administration would do, because President Trump has repeatedly spoken of America first, and even at his latest speech at the UNGA, he once again emphasized that countries must take care of themselves, and that has been the approach. But at the same time, most US governments and administrations have been skeptical of the UN. And even earlier, when you had administrations that used the UN, worked at the UN, worked through the UN, tried to get UN endorsements for the policies that they adopted, there was a lot of opposition in the United States for the norms coming from the UN. So the whole approach was that they use certainly the platform of the UN to get support for US preferences, but prevent norms coming out of the UN from impacting on the United States itself. So this was the whole idea of US exceptionalism, that the US would not be conditioned by what the multilateral process comes out of. And it was earlier US government that had walked out of some of the UN organizations. So I would say that with a change in presidency, there would perhaps be some change of emphasis, but we should not expect that the US would be ready to submit itself to international norms, as it were.
Let me continue on that question, but expand it a little. Catherine, you were talking about working on the JCPOA. At that point in time, it was possible to get cooperation between China and the United States. So when you're looking at this issue, you know, first, how much difference would a change of presidency make with the US? But secondly, is the growing divide between the US and China, whatever you want to call it, making it impossible to get the kind of cooperation that only a few years ago you could get with the JCPOA?
Trudy, it's a really good question. I mean, I start from the principle that there's no issue that you can name, or that I could name, that any nation can solve on its own. None. You can't do trade unless you have a partner. You can't deal with a pandemic except by collaboration. You can't work out what to do about the most important issue, which is how we save the world in terms of climate change, without thinking collaboratively. So at one level, what any individual nation may wish to do, however far populism may stalk the land and be seen to be about pulling up the drawbridge to be on your own, actually, like it or lump it, you end up in a situation where you have to collaborate. But linked to that, and answering your point, what is interesting to me is how much the collaboration of the informal structure rather than the formal structure is becoming the norm. The collaboration of the like-minded on a particular subject, the friends of, the contact group for, whatever you want to call them. And they are significant and important because it is a way of trying to get people, nations usually, organizations sometimes, to focus on a particular problem and deal with it, rather than trying to get all the underpinning values and ideals and beliefs at times, perhaps in democracy or whatever, to come to the fore. So I think whatever is said, collaborations will have to continue. What I think is going to be interesting from a UN perspective is how to link up those when they come in an informal way. And for China, as much as for America, as much as for Europe, as much as for Russia, there will still need to be collaborations if they're going to be successful, both politically and economically.
Well, just following up on that, you're talking about mini collaborations. Ambassador Singh was talking about new groupings looking at hard issues, hard power issues like the Quad 4. So Ambassador Bokova, are we reaching the point where the UN as United Nations is no longer going to be the central area where we try to get global cooperation? Can we stitch together these various pieces? Or is there too much of a divide now between the US and China working with Russia, for there to be a global cooperative efforts, and you're going to have to stitch together many pieces outside of the UN?
Well, Trudy, I think it's a very interesting question. I think still we will need the United Nations. We will need this big platform, and I can totally agree with Ambassador Singh when he said that nowadays there are no blocks of countries. It's a little bit more flexible. It's all different kind of regional groupings or groupings which think that they can defend their national interest better if they discuss and create different platforms. It's a very fragmented world nowadays. And precisely because the world is very fragmented, we need a place where at the end of the day, the notion, which unfortunately is fading away of a common public good. I think this is very important nowadays, whether it's peace, whether it's human security, it's health, it's education, it's fighting climate change. But at the end of the day, as Catherine just said, we are all in one boat in order to develop economies, societies, fight some of the challenges and others. But I really believe something is important, because you started the question by saying we the nations. Nowadays, United Nations, of course, it's about governments, but not only about governments. In fact, in the charter is we the peoples. And I think this is the big difference, because we know that there are very powerful movements, social movements, NGOs, civil society in many parts of the world, which are in different areas. We have seen the impact on fighting climate. We have seen also the impact now with the COVID, all these movements about vaccines and equity in the equipment and the providing of treatment of COVID-19. I think all this is very important. The fact that the private sector, through the Global Compact, the United Nations Global Compact, is also coming very strongly into the forefront of some of these big challenges. So we have a multiplier of actors, much bigger stakeholders that have an influence on these decisions. Even with climate change, we speak about the US, but look at what is happening with some states and cities that are taking the lead, private sector. So I'm a big believer in the in this multi-stakeholder, I would say, a platform that United Nations is much more wider, reaching out to wider groups, and there is no such, anywhere such platform. So it will stay. Of course, how we link it, rethinking it, they speak about reform, of this, of that. I don't like very much the word reform because it always, we speak always about it, but making it renewed and responding to the current challenges and to this panoply of actors, I think is very important.
So are you saying that these multi-stakeholder efforts and what has also been mentioned, the rise of civil society efforts, which are linked, both of these ideas, is the UN the place where such efforts will be coordinated? Or again, are we talking about efforts that go around the UN because the UN is increasingly paralyzed?
Well, I think to some extent it doesn't mean that the UN is coordinating, but the UN is opening to them more and more. And I have seen through my own experience the variety of NGO actors that we at UNESCO have been working, and United Nations globally. Look at the big NGOs that are working in the area of education, of the humanitarian action, sometimes the collaboration, the partnerships. It is not by chance that the goal number 17 of the Sustainable Development Agenda is about partnerships, because this is the way to solve these problems. Even if governments all are committed, if you don't have the private sector, if you don't have all the stakeholders in a society, we will not going to achieve it. So I wouldn't say formally coordinating it, but working in partnership definitely gives good results.
I would just like to throw out one more question before I get to questions from the listeners. The UN has been so active in the past in dealing with humanitarian crises. And something that hit me very deeply, there were so many huge humanitarian crises, was the Russian-Chinese veto limiting cross-border aid to Syrian civilians. I spent a lot of time in Syria, in Iraq, in Rojava, in the north of Syria. If the UN cannot deal with a crisis like the civilian suffering in Syria, if it's unable to take action against Myanmar over the Rohingya, if there's no way that it can confront China on the Uyghurs, and in fact, you had a situation where 37 nations sent a letter to the UN Human Rights Council praising China's contribution to the international human rights cause. Has the UN lost its ability to help with the humanitarian crises of our time? I throw that out. Raise a hand and I'll go first. Anyone want to take this, Ambassador Singh?
Yeah, no, I just want to say, as I had mentioned earlier, that UN is an organization of member states. So let's not blame the UN. It is because the member states, for their own purposes, have decided to take a certain approach. And they've decided to be guided by political considerations, overriding other issues when they sort of assess some of these things. And that has impacted. And that's in the nature of things. It's unfortunate, but that's how it is. UN is an organization of nation states, and nations will be guided by their own narrow nationalistic considerations.
Yes, I guess you say the world gets the UN it deserves. But I have a question here for Baroness Ashton. Do you think the JCPOA can be restored or revived? The questioner says, in its original form. I would add to that, is it possible in a new form? This is from Mehdi Askari.
It's an important question, because if there is a change in the White House, it's probably one of the first foreign policy issues that an incoming president will have to make an early statement, an early decision about. In brief, I've said this a million times to people, the Iran deal was only meant to deal with what I describe as the boulder in the doorway of the nuclear issue. There were plenty of things it did not do, and some of the criticisms aimed at it are simply wrong because they're suggesting it didn't do more and it wasn't meant to. What I think was really important as well, though, is that it had always been planned, certainly as far as I was concerned, that it would be the first agreement. We would move on to deal with some of the burning questions that people have about Iran in the region, about ballistic missiles and so on. And Trudy, you know these issues extremely well. And we haven't done that. So the answer to your question is, yes, I think an American president could say, all right, we go back, we take the JCPOA, Iran undoes what it has done subsequently to make the deal more wobbly. But in order for us to restore everything that we did before, it is on the assumption, on the agreement that we begin the negotiations because the world is moving on and times have changed. And I think doing that and doing that effectively would allay some of the fears that people had that Iran was emboldened by the agreement and that other issues have just been left aside in situations where Iran has become stronger. And so you can't ignore those anymore. But I do think you'd have to start from a position of Iran understanding that what they had signed up to and we had signed up to would stick. And so I would do I would do both of those things simultaneously. It will not be easy, but I think that's what should happen.
Thanks very much. I have another question from an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel whose name I will dare to try to pronounce, Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Niewarowski, and excuse me if I mispronounce, who asks, should the United States consider supporting a permanent Indian Security Council seat? And I would add to that, is there really any chance that the permanent seating on the UN Security Council can ever be changed? Or should we just give up on that and be looking at some other method or means of getting a country of the significance of India to have more say on the council? Ambassador Singh.
So one, as I had described in my initial comments, the world has changed dramatically from what it was in 1945. And clearly the structure of decision-making and governance at the UN needs to change. And a country of India's capacity, size, influence clearly needs to be very much a part of the permanent membership of the UN Security Council. The United States has already expressed support for India's permanent membership of the UN Security Council. It was done by President Obama when he had visited India in 2010 and has been subsequently reiterated on many occasions. But a reform of the Security Council is not going to be easy. It's a process that has been attempted for many years, but it's a process that requires concurrence of all the 5 permanent members of UN Security Council, requires ratification by the governments, subsequently required approval by 2/3 of the membership of the UN, United Nations. So it's not a process that's going to be easy. And again, a lot of people are asking the question that are we fighting the last war with technologies of today? And whether the UN Security Council is as relevant today as it may have been in the post-World War II phase. So those are valid questions, but ultimately I think we all need to work out a more effective form of governance for the new international order.
Thanks very much. I have a question here from Kimberly Naranha, who asks, following on Ambassador Bokova's comment on cities, with an increasing push for more localized administrative units, like cities and their mayors, to have a more active role in multilateral bodies like the UN. How do you see the role forward given the current geopolitics? And how do you see this impacting the way that the UN works? And another similar question on the same subject to Lady Ashton is if she could elaborate, this is from Michael Francek, if she could elaborate on what the reform of UN funding should look like, especially with regard to public-private partnerships and groups with the Gates Foundation. So basically, two questions on how to get civil society and private partners in to the UN structure. Let me start with Ambassador Bokova. How do you get these local administrative units connected in with the way the UN works?
It's really a very good question, because urban development in cities, we know that this is the future. We know that just in the next 20, 30 years, 60% of the world population will live in cities. And I would say sustainable development, climate, inclusion, inequalities, discrimination sometimes, all this is taking place in cities. So cities, really urban development is important. That is why on the Sustainable Development Agenda, there is a special goal. It is goal number 11, which is about sustainable cities, and there are plenty of activities around it. There is the Habitat, of course, the UN organization that is working mostly, but not only, I think everybody is looking there. Just if you take the problem of climate change, we should know that cities are the biggest also emitter of CO2 in the atmosphere, and also cities is where the future of the climate change will be played. That is why during the COP21 here in Paris, there was a coalition of mayors that has been established, and there is a very active role that this coalition of mayors for climate is doing their work, and they're of course working with the governments, with UN, with the others. But I really do believe, independent of where the institutional structure of countries is about more decentralized or more centralized, in any case, cities are playing a hugely important role. And we, as I said, that I think also Catherine mentioned this informal kind of work that is being done, and the informal structures today, they're very important. And working in all these informal structures is vital sometimes for achieving sustainability that we want.
And Catherine, this question of reforming UN funding. So what should it look like with regard to public-private partnerships and foundations?
I think Michael's question is a really good one, Trudy, and I think I would differentiate, first of all, between core and project. My references in my opening remarks were much more to the core funding, where I fear, and I've witnessed, the removal of funding as being a kind of weapon of choice that will be waved at any threat that the UN may do something that an individual country does not like. And we have to move away from that, not least because organizations that are doing valuable work, and I think of Ambassador Bokova's work in UNESCO as a classic example of work that is, should be continuing regardless. It should not be subject to being threatened by a reduction, at particularly this juncture in its life, because of political issues that are going on. So there are a number of ways that you could try and do that, none of them easy, but it's about sources of funding, it's about nation states' commitment that cannot be undone. It's not so impossible to make commitments that commit for the future. Certainly the EU commits for the future. When I was in office, I was making commitments for the future that would be fulfilled, and so on, and trying to get the core funding on a much better basis. In terms of public-private partnerships, in terms of the capacity to work with organizations like the Gates Foundation, like others, I think it's about examining what it is you want to do. There's no question that there's money sloshing around the system quite often on issues that needs to be harnessed more effectively in partnership if it can, in order for it to achieve a much greater outcome. So I would like to see a bit of a focus, what I call the follow the money, because the money in the end can be the big driver that can make a difference. And so I hope that the combination of certainty for the core and creativity on the partnerships will help the UN to drive forward some of the many challenges that are now going to be faced in the future.
I have a question from Leo Luan, whom I'm assuming is a student, because he asks all our panelists what they would do if they were a young adult now at this moment of global crisis. What advice would they give to current Penn students concerned about international affairs? Should they try to be part of civil society working on these issues? Where should they focus their energies and their efforts? So I see you shaking your head. Sorry, Ambassador Singh, do you want to comment on that?
So I teach at a university in Delhi, and very often students come to me to ask the same question, whether they should remain engaged with international affairs and what paths to follow. And I advise them that there are many paths. They could look at joining the government, they could go into academia, they could look at think tank structures, or they could go into business. Because even when you're in business, your business is going to be impacted by the way the world is evolving, by nature of relations between countries, by the kind of trade and economic patterns they establish. So anybody who is in business who is better able to understand global trends will be one step ahead of their competitors. So my advice is, whatever field of work you're in, do pay attention to international trends and developments, and they will stand you in good stead.
Right, and as a last question, I'm delighted to ask Ambassador Bokova, as Sabrina Arias asks you, what do you think about the future prospects for a woman as Secretary General? Do you think this will happen in our lifetimes, and what impact might be on UN activities? And as you made a great run for that position, you're in a particularly good position to answer Ms. Arias. So please.
Well, my very short answer is I hope so, not very far future. But if I just take a little bit this issue, I'm a bit frustrated that some of the gains that women have done during these last decades and efforts of the United Nations, unfortunately, being lost because of the crisis, because of the COVID, because of the feeling that it's a world of power, it's a world of hard politics, and women do not have their place there because it is they're not strong enough. And if you look at those countries that really managed the COVID quite well, many of them, if not most, are led by women. So I really believe that women, I wouldn't say women are better than men, but women can lead, women can be good leaders. It doesn't mean that you have to shout, but good leaders sometimes with compassion, as the Prime Minister of New Zealand after the Christchurch bombing. I think she was a wonderful example of a strong leader, a leadership that we need nowadays, with a vision, with respect for values, with compassion, and with caring. And I would like to see this much more in nowadays world, where we see this balance of power and violence that is coming also much, much more into the forefront of international politics.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all the panelists. There is so much more we could have discussed and so many more questions that I didn't get to ask you. But hopefully there'll be a follow-on. So I want to hand back to Mike Horowitz for a few closing remarks.
Thank you all so much. I mean, this has been a tremendous way to close a virtual Global Order colloquium. While, you know, of course it would be, we wish we could convene in person. I mean, this is an incredible conversation with, you know, people from around the world, from 3 different continents having this conversation. And that's a, you know, an example of trying to use the benefit, you know, us being virtual for positive. If you take a look at the chat, you can see links to all of our upcoming events at Perry World House. We hope you'll sign up for our mailing list and follow us on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram at Perry World House. We've got a whole lot coming up over the next few weeks, especially before the US election. And we hope you'll continue to join us. And thanks again to our panelists and to Trudy for such a tremendous conversation. We're really in your debt for teaching us all about what global leadership looks like in the future of multilateral institutions at such a tumultuous point in global history.